Hi, my name is Lauren Foley, and today I'm going to discuss my final project for Bio 316. Today, I'll be focusing on the historical significance of evolution and genetic variance through the lens of the African ray-finned fish, otherwise known as the cichlid. The article I chose to do this project on gives a small glimpse into the vast world that is evolution. This article discusses a specific species of cichlid and how their unique two-job mechanism came about. Scientists previously thought that this mechanism evolved through the process called decoupling, but recent findings suggest that this mechanism actually evolves through a linked system. In consideration of this new evidence, scientists are able to look at different species of cichlid in a new evolutionary light. Here on this slide is a photograph that's taken by C. Albertson, a professor from the University of Massachusetts. And we can see how the two-job mechanism works in action. This case of the African cichlid provided by the article also provides an interesting example in both evolution and genetic variation. In light of this fishy example, we're going to be discussing the history of genetic variance and evolution, and how exactly that connects to the knowledge that the scientific community currently has today. The scientific community didn't always have the knowledge like we do today. So let's dive into the history of how scientists were able to come up with the accurate terms for genetic variation like we see in the case for the African cichlids. Of course, like much of science, the history of what we've come to know as genetic variance is not so clear-cut like we observe today. In the early 19th century, those in the scientific community began to question the root of normal versus abnormal development, and began calling this sort of difference in development monstrosities or malformations. Many of these scientists had their own theory as to how these malformations arose during development. For example, Johann Friedrich Meckel, a scientist in the early 1800s, studied these abnormal developments and considered these to be a result of deviations from whatever these normal process of development was. Meckel, as well as other scientists, allowed for the ultimate understanding of genetic variance as we know today. In considering the cichlids, a study from Lowe et al. In 2013 highlights the genetic differentiation within the cichlid species, highlighting the difference in what we now know of genetic variation versus the history. So, how exactly does genetic variation in the case of the cichlids connect to the history of evolution? Well, the origins of evolution weren't exactly clear-cut either, just like the origins of genetic variation as well as what we've come to know about the cichlids. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, scientists tried understanding and describing how species are essentially organized. These early concepts of organization in species focused on notions of progress and perfection in species as opposed to methods of how they survive and how natural selection works, even though they didn't really have an understanding of natural selection like we do today. A prominent idea in evolution's vast history is Darwin's new suggestion that included a mechanism by which species evolve over time. This theory of Darwin's lacked evidence for heredity and other small details, but his ideas would ultimately help shape the understanding of how we know species evolve today. Additionally, Friedman and Smith suggest that studying historical accounts, like fossils, is pertinent to understanding evolution, especially in the case of the cichlids, as they are rich in genetic variation and can shed much light on the process of evolution. Okay. To start off with a quote from Robert Richards in 2009 from his book titled The Meaning of Evolution, quote, "The term evolution is pregnant with its history," unquote. I feel like this quote can be applied to a lot of other facets of the history of science, especially in the case of genetic variance and the case of the cichlids. This quote especially highlights the debates that were sparked by the new announcements made by Darwin, that was evolution, especially by the mechanism of natural selection. These theories were met with opposition, and a lot of scientists weren't ready to really accept these ideas. This case is a common theme seen in a lot of scientific beginnings as new developments are proposed. And a lot of scientists beg the question, what is considered right? Oftentimes, scientists have to go through a lot of trial and error to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And we can see that throughout the history of science, especially through evolution and genetic variation. These new announcements essentially challenge what scientists already know. That might be why scientists are so reluctant to accept new ideas. From what we learned in the cases of the African ray-fin fish known as the cichlid, as well as evolution and genetic variation, we can see that science is essentially an ever-growing process about learning, testing things, figuring out what works and what doesn't. It's essentially an ever-growing process in understanding. Again, with these cases that we saw in this lecture, similarities can be seen throughout many cases in history concerning responses to new developments. We can see in the history of evolution and genetic variants that some of these theories were met with opposition, which ultimately helped shape the way we know the theories today. Additionally, the case of the cichlids can help shed light on the significance of how we've come to understand evolution and genetic variation. Thank you for watching, and I hope this deepened your understanding of the history of genetic variation, evolution, and how this connects to the cichlid.